The heavy glass doors of Sterling and Rowe's flagship kitchen whispered shut behind him with a quiet hiss. It was well past midnight and the restaurant had closed hours ago. Alexander Sterling stepped into the dim, sterile light that flicked on automatically as he moved. No one was supposed to be here. His polished shoes clicked softly against the marble floor, his tailored navy suit catching faint reflections from overhead LEDs. He hadn't planned on being here tonight. In fact, no one even knew he was back in New York. His flight from London had landed early, but something about a troubling report from his operations manager gnawed at him during the ride home, a complaint about sanitation and inconsistent staff logs. He hadn't spoken to anyone. He'd simply told the driver to take him straight to the restaurant. He moved through the prep area slowly, noting a few pans left out to dry and the faint smell of bleach in the air. At first, everything looked in order until his heel slipped slightly. It was nothing dramatic, just a moment where the ground felt unsure. He looked down and saw a slick sheen of water spread near the walk-in freezer. His eyes narrowed. Then he saw it. At first it looked like a bundle of cloth, but the shape wasn't right. It was too curved, too human. Alexander crouched, his sharp eyes adjusting to the dim light. His breath caught. There was a young woman curled tightly on the floor, barely covered by what looked like a kitchen towel. Her pale skin was damp against the freezing tile, her long hair tangled and sticking to her face and neck. She was barefoot, shivering, completely naked except for that flimsy strip of cloth. Alexander froze. The image didn't make sense. Number 1 was supposed to be here, and certainly not like this. He stepped closer, heart rate climbing. Kneeling beside her, he checked her pulse. It was faint, but there. Her lips were blue. Her fingers were curled loosely around a damp apron, as if she had tried to keep it on but lost the strength. Nearby, a pile of soaked clothing lay in a heap, her uniform from the looks of it. Something metallic glinted faintly under the flickering light. An ID badge. He picked it up. Claire Hayes, cleaner, night shift. Alexander's jaw tightened. He rose quickly, striding to the wall-mounted phone near the service door. Within seconds, he was calling emergency services. Yes, I need an ambulance. Female mid-20s, unconscious, hypothermic, no visible injuries. Location Sterling and Rowe 5th Avenue rear kitchen entrance. As he gave the details, his gaze kept drifting back to the girl, to Claire. There was something about her expression, even in unconsciousness, dense and guarded, like someone used to sleeping with one eye open. The sound of pounding footsteps echoed down the hall. Jason, the overnight security guard, appeared slightly breathless. Sir, is everything all right? Call the manager on duty. Alexander's voice was clipped. I want to know why a cleaner is unconscious and naked on the floor of my restaurant. Jason's eyes darted to the figure on the ground. He nodded quickly and hurried away. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Alexander stayed silent as the EMTs worked, wrapping Claire in blankets, checking her vitals, placing an oxygen mask over her face. One of the medics glanced at him. She's lucky. Another hour, and the outcome would have been very different. I own this place, Alexander said flatly. That explains why you're here this late, the medic replied, but not why she was. Neither can I, he murmured quietly. They wheeled her into the ambulance. Alexander followed, stepping out into the chilled night air. The cold brushed against his face like a warning. Hospital, he instructed his driver, as the car pulled out onto the empty avenue. Alexander sat back, staring out at the dark streets, but his mind wasn't on the city. It was on the image. He couldn't shake a cleaner, his cleaner, alone. Vulnerable and unnoticed on the cold tile of a kitchen built for luxury and acclaim. By the time Alexander arrived at St. Luke's Hospital, Claire was already in treatment. He didn't know why he stayed, but he did. An hour passed, then another. Finally, a nurse approached him and said she was stable. Her body temperature had been brought back to normal. Fluids were given, and she was resting. The nurse asked if he wanted to see her. He nodded. The room was quiet, lit by a single lamp. Claire lay in the hospital bed, small under the crisp white sheets. Her hair had been brushed back from her face, making her look younger. Her breathing was soft, but her hands were still pale from the cold. Alexander sat beside her for a long time without speaking. Eventually, he placed her ID badge on the tray next to the bed. He pulled out his business card, wrote a few words on the back, and left it there. "You deserve better." When he left the room, the hallway felt colder than when he had entered, though it wasn't the air. It was something shifting inside him, quiet, but certain. The next morning, Alexander sat alone in his private office above the restaurant. The blinds were still drawn. He hadn't slept a single hour. In front of him lay two items: Claire Hayes' damp ID card and a report from the night manager, rushed together at Alexander's demand. He had read it twice, and it still made no sense. According to the log, Claire clocked out at 10:57 p.m. Her shift ended at 11. No incidents. No complaints. So why had she been found unconscious and undressed on the kitchen floor after 1 in the morning? Alexander leaned back, rubbing his temples. He called for Matthew Lane, his operations director. Matthew entered, holding a tablet, looking tense. "Sir, I've pulled the internal camera footage you requested." "Show me," Alexander ordered. The video played on the large wall screen. At 10:56 p.m., Claire was seen folding her apron, placing it in a locker near the side exit, and waving to a coworker. She picked up her bag, walked out the staff door, and disappeared from view. Alexander frowned. That matched the time she clocked out. "Keep going," he said. Matthew skipped forward. An hour. The hallway camera activated again. Claire appeared. Same clothes, same bag, alone. Head down. She didn't sign in. She didn't speak to anyone. She walked directly to the back kitchen. This time she wore gloves. The footage showed her pulling out cleaning supplies, setting her bag aside, and scrubbing behind the industrial ovens, a section not assigned to her shift. She worked with urgency, as if racing a clock no one else could see. At 12:15 a.m., the automated sink triggered with too much pressure, spraying water across the tile. She slipped, caught herself, then went to the supply closet. She returned with towels, cleaning spray, and a spare apron. The camera caught her wringing out her soaked clothes at the utility sink. When she stood again, her uniform clung to her like paper. 20 minutes passed. She walked out of frame. 10 minutes later, the footage showed Alexander arriving. Alexander stared at the frozen image. His voice was low. "So she came back to clean a place no one asked her to clean." "Why?" Matthew hesitated. "I spoke to her coworker, Alina. She said Claire often volunteered for extra work, said she needed more hours, but we couldn't give her overtime. She's on a contract, no benefits, limited hours." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "But she still came back." "Yes, sir. No one stopped her. No one thought to." Alexander turned toward the window. The early sun cut through the fog, pale light spilling onto the carpet. "What else do we know about her?" Matthew checked the tablet. "She applied 3 months ago through a staffing agency. She's 24, lives in Queens, single guardian of a dependent." Alexander's head turned. "Dependent?" Matthew hesitated. "Her mother, late-stage kidney failure. She's on dialysis 3 times a week." Alexander's chest tightened. "Did she ever request financial assistance from the company?" "No, sir. She barely talks to anyone. Most staff thought she didn't speak much English. She just kept her head down, cleaned, and left." Alexander looked back at the paused video. This time he noticed more the way her shoulders hunched, the thinness of her frame, the careful steps like she was afraid to make a sound. She didn't look like she belonged in a place polished for high society. The next call Alexander made was to the hospital. She was stable, awake, and resting. Her mother hadn't been contacted yet. Alexander left immediately. When Alexander arrived at St. Luke's, Claire was sitting upright in her hospital bed. A thin foreline was attached to her arm. Her eyes looked tired, distant. She turned quickly. When she saw him, startled. "Mr. Sterling," her voice was soft, almost uncertain. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean for anyone to find me like that. I didn't even realize I'd passed out. I thought I could just wait for my clothes to dry and then leave. I didn't want to cause trouble. Alexander shook his head. That's not why I'm here. I came because I saw someone lying on my kitchen floor who clearly didn't belong there. Not because she broke a rule, but because she believed no one would care. Her eyes flickered downward. I just wanted to do more. They said I couldn't have extra hours, but I thought if I kept the place cleaner, maybe someone would notice. Maybe they'd let me stay longer. Maybe I could afford my mother's next treatment. Her voice trembled. Turns out, I couldn't. Even managed to stay awake. Alexander didn't smile. He sat in the chair next to her bed. No one should have to work that hard just to be seen. She shook her head. I'm not a victim. I just needed to be useful. You nearly froze to death trying to earn minutes in a place that wouldn't even put you on a full-time schedule. That's not on you. That's on me. On this company. On the system we built. Her eyes lifted to meet his. There was no anger, there just exhaustion. I don't need pity, Mr. Sterling. I need my job. I need to work. Alexander nodded slowly. Then I'll make sure when you work, someone actually sees you. She was silent for a moment, then looked away. I'm not asking you to do anything. For me, she murmured. I know, Alexander replied. That's exactly why I am. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and placed it on the small table beside her bed. Your job is secure. For now, I want you to recover. I'll cover your full wages. I'll also handle your hospital expenses. And your mother's dialysis will be covered through our private medical network. She stared at him, brows furrowed. Why are you doing this? You don't even know me. Alexander folded his hands, his gaze steady. Maybe that's the problem. I never tried to know you. I don't want that to stay true. Her voice caught for a moment. I didn't want you to notice me like this. I just needed the hours. No one should have to beg to be seen, Claire. Especially someone who has been keeping the place running in the background. Her eyes glimmered, though she didn't cry. She drew in a breath. Thank you, but I still want to work. I want to feel like I earned it. That's why I have a proposal, he said. I've created a temporary position guest hygiene consultant. You'll evaluate the cleaning systems across our branches. Tell us what's broken, what no one else sees. She blinked. That sounds like a job for someone who matters. You matter, Alexander replied. And I want to learn from someone who has been doing the job everyone else overlooks. Claire hesitated, then finally said, I'll try. That night. When Alexander left the hospital, he didn't go home. Instead, he stopped by the restaurant and walked through the same kitchen where he had found her. It was spotless now, gleaming as it always did. But this time, he noticed details: the missing floor mats near the freezer, the draft from the broken vent, the mop rack dripping onto the floor. All of it had been there for years. It had taken a young woman half frozen on the tile for him to see it. 2 days later, Claire was discharged from the hospital. She refused Alexander's offer to send a driver, insisting on taking a cab home on her own. Her pride was quiet but firm. Her apartment in Queens was small, a narrow walk-up. Alexander had arranged for a professional caregiver to help her mother while Claire recovered. The older woman was frail and soft-spoken, her sharp eyes skeptical of strangers. When Alexander visited that weekend, she regarded him carefully before offering a faint smile. You're the man who saw her, she said simply. The man who didn't step over her. Claire flushed. Mum, please. Alexander didn't deny it. I suppose I finally looked down. In the weeks that followed, Claire began her new role as guest hygiene consultant. It was more than a title. She quietly visited multiple Sterling and Rowe branches, talking with cleaning crews, observing conditions, and writing reports that were startling in their insight. Her evaluations didn't just list problems, they told stories. She spoke of the woman who walked home at midnight because there were no transportation vouchers. Of the man with arthritis, still expected to scrub floors on his knees. Of the teenager working 2 jobs, afraid to ask for gloves. That fit. Alexander read every word. He didn't just file her reports away. He started making changes: new cleaning schedules, better equipment, small allowances that made big differences. One afternoon, Alexander attended a janitorial staff meeting. For the first time in years, he didn't speak as a CEO. He sat and listened. Claire sat a few seats away, quietly watching him. After one long inspection day in Harlem, Alexander offered to buy her dinner. Not at one of his high-end restaurants, but at a small noodle shop. Tucked between two old brick buildings, she hesitated before agreeing. Inside, they sat in a corner booth over bowls of ramen. Claire spoke about her mother, her childhood, and how she used to hum while cleaning to keep herself from crying. Alexander listened closely, and when he spoke, it wasn't about business. He told her about his own mother, how she passed away when he was 17, and how he buried himself in work so he wouldn't have to feel the loss. "You still feel helpless sometimes, don't you?" she asked gently. "More than I'd like to admit," he said quietly. She reached across the table and plucked a stray noodle from his tie. Their eyes met for a moment. The air shifted between them. Alexander's hand brushed hers by accident, but she didn't pull away. When they left the shop, it was drizzling. Alexander offered her his coat. She declined at first, but he insisted. "You gave me warmth when I didn't know I needed it," he said. "Let me return it." She smiled faintly and wrapped it around her shoulders. They walked side by side down the quiet street. Nothing was said, but both of them knew something had changed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Over the next several weeks, Claire settled into her role. She visited branch after branch, working quietly, talking to people no one else noticed, and sending reports that kept challenging the way Alexander's company operated. Alexander reviewed every one of them personally. Sometimes he called her in to discuss them, sometimes he'd just read them alone and thought about the woman who had written them. Their meetings began about work, but they didn't always end that way. Sometimes it was coffee after an inspection, sometimes a shared cab ride when the rain caught them off guard, sometimes it was silence, just the two of them looking out over the city from a quiet rooftop. Both lost in their own thoughts, but strangely comfortable in the stillness. One evening, Alexander noticed she looked tired. Not the usual fatigue of work, but something heavier. "Are you all right?" he asked. She hesitated. "My mum's worse. The treatments help, but she's tired. And I'm scared." "You don't have to pretend you're fine," Alexander said quietly. "If I stop pretending, I'll fall apart. And if I fall apart, who takes care of her?" He didn't have an answer. He just placed a steady hand on her back. She didn't pull away. That night, Alexander didn't go home. He walked through the city until the buildings gave way to trees. In the quiet of the park, he thought about her, about how familiar her exhaustion looked. He had seen it in his own mother's eyes. The next morning, he went to her apartment, not with flowers or gifts, but with a simple container of soup he had made himself. Claire opened the door, surprised. Her hair was unbrushed, her eyes tired. "I thought you'd be in meetings," she said. "I was," he replied. "Then I left. This seemed more important." He set the soup on her counter. "My mother used to make this when I was sick. It doesn't fix everything, but it helps." She stared at him, then at the soup. "You cooked it yourself?" "Yes." She gave a soft laugh, almost surprised at herself. "I thought you had people for that." "I do, but some things you don't delegate." She sat at the table and ate slowly. "Thank you. You didn't have to come, I know," he said. "But I wanted to." They never spoke about that morning again. But from then on, their silences were different. One Friday, after an inspection in Brooklyn, Claire invited Alexander to dinner with a small group of cleaners at a local diner. At first he hesitated. She looked at him with steady confidence. "If you want to understand what we live, you have to sit with us." So he went. Over greasy fries and bottomless coffee, Alexander listened to their stories. Missed birthdays, bad backs, dreams put on hold. He laughed when they laughed, listened when they cried. For the first time, he wasn't the CEO. He was just Alexander. As they walked to the station afterward, he turned to Claire. "Thank you for showing me the parts of this world I never saw." "You saw them," she said softly. You just didn't know what they meant. The next day, Alexander asked her to go somewhere with him. Somewhere quiet. She hesitated, then agreed. He took her upstate, just the two of them. No press, no staff. Just a car, a basket of food, and a quiet lake shimmering in the sunlight. They sat by the shore, shoes off, feet in the water. I haven't felt this peaceful in years, she said. Me neither, he admitted. After a while, she turned to him. Why me? Why did you keep coming back? Because when I saw you on that kitchen floor, I realized I'd spent years building walls to keep the world out. And you made me want to open a door. She leaned forward and kissed him softly, hesitantly, as if testing whether the world would allow it. When she pulled back, she whispered, I'm scared. So am I, Alexander replied. But this feels real, and maybe that's worth being scared for. The weeks that followed felt different, but neither of them defined what was happening. Their workdays stayed professional, almost deliberately so. But their evenings, when they happened, were quieter, warmer. Alexander was careful, not because he doubted how he felt, but because he understood the weight of it. He had spent most of his life surrounded by polished ambition and carefully managed relationships. Claire was nothing like that. She didn't ask for anything. She rarely accepted anything. Even the simplest gestures sometimes made her hesitate. One evening, after a long day of inspections, they had dinner in her small apartment. It was quiet, just the sound of forks against plates and the city murmuring outside. When they finished, Alexander reached into his jacket and handed her a small envelope. Inside was a check. Claire stared at it, the number shocking her into silence. What is this? I wanted to help, he said carefully. You're helping already, she said, her voice steady but firmer than usual. This isn't payment, Claire. It's support, a gift. She set the envelope back on the table. I don't want it, Claire. I'm not angry, she said gently, but I've worked too hard to build a life where I can stand on my own. If I take that check, I'm afraid I'll forget how to stand. Alexander looked at her and finally understood. This wasn't about pride. It was about survival. All her life, she had been offered conditions wrapped in kindness, help that came with strings, sometimes invisible, sometimes not. She didn't want to be saved. She wanted to be believed in. He reached across the table and took her hand. Then let me invest in what you're already building. Not by buying it, but by standing beside it. Her shoulders eased slightly. That I can accept. The next day she returned to her inspections with more determination than ever. Her reports started reaching not just Alexander, but the full board of operations. Some executives doubted her at first, but her results were undeniable. Complaints dropped. Staff morale improved. Turnover in the janitorial teams was cut in half. One afternoon during a review meeting, a senior manager asked her how she had figured out so much so quickly. Claire didn't hesitate. You listen more when you're invisible. Alexander walked her to the elevator afterward. You amaze me, he said. She smiled without looking at him. You amaze me, too. Summer settled over the city, heavy and restless. But inside Claire's world, the weight felt different. Her mother's health was declining. The treatments still helped, but less each time. After a long day inspecting the Queen's branch, Claire came home to find her mother coughing weakly. The caregiver, Gloria, had done everything right, but nothing could stop what Claire already feared. That night, she sat in her dim kitchen, a mug of tea cooling between her hands. When Alexander knocked, she didn't answer at first. His voice came softly through the door. Claire, I know you're there. Finally, she opened it. Her eyes were red. He stepped inside without a word and sat across from her. She's worse, Claire said quietly. The doctors don't say it, but I see it. She forgets things. Her hands shake. She barely eats. I'll make sure she has everything she needs. Alexander said immediately. That's not what I want, Claire replied, her voice unsteady. I don't want you to fix it. I just want someone to sit here and not try to make it go away. Alexander was silent for a moment, then nodded. All right, then I'll just be here. so he stayed. For hours, they spoke very little. When her head finally rested against his shoulder, her breathing even, he didn't move. Not when her hand slipped into his, not when the room grew colder, not even when Gloria called softly from the bedroom. Days later, her mother was admitted to the hospital. Claire barely slept, splitting her time between the hospital and her work. She never asked for help. She didn't slow down. Alexander watched her carefully. One evening, after she returned from the hospital with dark circles under her eyes, he pulled her aside into his private office and closed the door. "I want you to take some time off," he said. "Not because I think you can't handle things, but because even strong people break if they're never allowed to rest." "I don't want to feel like I'm walking away from my work," she said quietly. "You're not," Alexander told her. "You're walking toward what matters most right now. I'll keep things steady here." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Just a few days, I'll come back. I always do." "I know," Alexander said with a small smile. "And I'll be here." She stepped away from work and stayed with her mother day and night. She read aloud from old recipe books, sang softly, and held her mother's hand during dialysis. Sometimes she called Alexander late at night, just to say she was tired. He always answered. When the call came that her mother had passed, Alexander was already halfway to the hospital. He found Claire sitting alone in the hallway, hands in her lap, eyes dry but far away. She didn't cry until he sat down beside her and whispered, "I'm so sorry." She turned, burying her face against him, and the tears came quietly. That night, Alexander took her home. He didn't ask if she wanted company. He made tea, sat beside her, and stayed. When she fell asleep on the couch, he covered her with a blanket and spent the night in a chair nearby. Watching the slow rise and fall of her breath, in the days that followed, he helped with everything: funeral arrangements, closing hospital records, making sure Gloria received full pay. But more than anything, he gave her space. He didn't try to fill the silence. He simply stayed steady at her side. A week after the funeral, Claire walked into Alexander's office. She stood in the doorway, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm ready to come back." Alexander looked up from his desk. "Only if you're sure." "I am. But everything feels different now, like I'm standing in a new life." He stepped toward her, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Then, let's build this one together." Her eyes softened. "Okay, but no saving, no rescuing, just walking beside me," he nodded. "Always." That night, she didn't go back to her own apartment. She stayed at his townhouse. Not because she was fragile, not because she was grieving, but because she chose to. When Alexander wrapped his arms around her, it wasn't about comfort. When she turned toward him and touched his face, it wasn't about escape. It was about belonging. From that point on, their rhythm shifted. They didn't make declarations, they didn't define it. But their days began and ended together. In the mornings, it was coffee in the kitchen before work. In the evenings, it was quiet dinners, or simply sitting side by side in comfortable silence. Claire kept her work. Alexander kept his responsibilities. But slowly, their lives began to overlap in ways that felt natural. For the first time, Alexander wasn't trying to fit someone into his life. He was sharing it. As autumn settled over New York, the changes inside Sterling and Rowe became impossible to ignore. The atmosphere in the company felt different. Janitors and cleaners who once moved quickly through hallways now lingered, greeted by name. Managers started paying closer attention to staff on every level. Small programs quietly began to appear: emergency leave support, transportation vouchers, health coverage expansions. None of it was announced with big speeches, but the results were clear. Alexander called these changes Claire's initiatives, though she never asked him to attach her name to anything. When she found out, she stood in his office with her familiar, quiet determination. "You don't have to make me the face of your apology tour," she said. "This isn't penance," Alexander replied, meeting her eyes. "This is foundation. What I build next, I want it to be with you in it. Not because of the night in the kitchen, but because you made me see the ground I was walking on." She held his gaze. "I'm not here to be anyone's symbol. I'm not here to remind you of what you almost missed. I'm here because I choose to be, and I won't stay if this becomes about pity. Alexander stepped closer, his voice steady. Then let it be about love. Let it be about a man who sees a woman standing on her own and chooses to walk beside her. Not to save her, not to change her, but to be changed by her. The word love caught her off guard. For a moment, she looked uncertain, but in his eyes, she saw no performance, just steadiness, and something in her finally eased. Almost a year had passed since the night. Alexander found Claire on the kitchen floor. Winter lights spilled through the windows of a staff. Breakfast held for the company's maintenance and cleaning teams. Alexander stood at the front of the room, Claire at his side. The room was filled with quiet energy. People who had once gone unseen were now sitting at tables where their voices mattered. Alexander raised his glass. This company was built on polished surfaces and quiet labor, but its future will be built on names, on dignity, on the people we overlooked for far too long. This woman, he said, turning to Claire, showed me what I never saw. Loving her has taught me that strength isn't silence, it's empathy, it's staying when it's hard. The room erupted in applause. Some people stood, a few cried later. That day, Claire walked through the same hallway where she had once mopped floors after hours. But this time, people stepped aside, not out of obligation, but out of respect. As she passed the kitchen where everything had begun, she paused. The floor was spotless. A rubber mat now lay beneath the sink. A heater had been installed under the drafty vent. Above the mop rack hung a small plaque. For the ones we forgot to see. Claire smiled softly and turned away. Not because she needed to hold on to the past, but because she had already stepped into something new. A life not given, not saved, but chosen. And beside her walked a man who no longer needed to be cold, to feel strong, because now they carried the warmth together.